Hi, I'm Noe Newman, and welcome to our second citrus cultivation workshop. This one will be on propagation and fertilization. Thank you to Kahumana Organic Farms, Hawaii Farmers Union Waianae, Hawaii Tropical Fruit Growers, and my farm, Lokoea Farms, for supporting this presentation. Kahumana Farm Hub is a group of backyard growers, primarily on the west side of Oahu, who are growing all different kinds of fruits and vegetables, and they group together to buy and sell their produce. Kahumana got a grant from the Department of Ag, State of Hawaii, and the USDA Specialty Crop Program to hold a series of workshops on mango, a series on citrus, and a series on breadfruit this year. So we are in the citrus series. If you're growing the other fruit, I recommend that you look those up as well. So here are our four planned out workshops. We had the first one, Overview Planting and Pruning, on January 11th. We had planned to have the second one on March 11th, but we ended up having to have a virtual presentation because of the coronavirus, obviously. And we have two more workshops planned that we hopefully will be able to have in person, one on pests and diseases and one on post-harvest quality management and marketing challenges. And again, these all are in relation to citrus growing. So just a quick background on me. I have not met all of you because we're doing this virtually. Some photos of me at my farm, Lokoea Farms in Haleiwa. We are a family-run farm, between 8 and 9 acres, and we grow primarily citrus, but also different kinds of tropical fruit. This is an overview of Lokoea Farms. The blue field down at the bottom is primarily Hawaiian oranges. We have a few different types so that we have fruit all year round. The far right corner of the blue field is now cleared, and that is the new Hawaii Tropical Fruit Growers Fruit Tree Repository. So members of the Hawaii Tropical Fruit Growers Association will be able to use those trees to propagate more trees for their own farms. It's a great organization to join if you grow fruit. The red field, we call it our avocado field, but it really has a variety of different tropical fruit and citrus. We have grapefruit, caracara oranges, Tahitian limes, as well as mango, avocado, lychee, longan, sapotes, all kinds of things. And the black field up on top is our Meyer lemon field. Some more photos of the farm, some of our young lemon trees. Where the farm is now used to be sugarcane land for years and years. So when I was a kid, I grew up here. You can see the sugarcane right where, let's see what would be growing there right now. That's right in our lemon field. So where our lemons are now growing is where they used to have sugarcane growing. Okay, so let's get into our presentation. First section will be about propagation of citrus. You might be thinking, what does propagation even mean? All propagation means is ways to make more plants. Usually when you tell people, how do you make another plant, they think, oh, you plant a seed. But most of the time with fruit trees, that's not the best way to propagate. With citrus, the most common commercial method of propagation is budding or bud grafting. Another type of grafting that's used a lot is cleft grafts, and pretty much any grafting method that you prefer you can use with citrus to clone. Many kinds of citrus can be propagated by rooting cuttings, which is a very easy way to propagate, so that's kind of nice. Some people like to propagate citrus by air layering, and you can propagate with seeds, but we'll get into it later why that's maybe not the best idea. There's a few words you need to know before we talk about grafting. So you need to know what a rootstock is. Rootstock is a plant that you grow out usually in your nursery, usually from seed, and it has to be closely related to whatever plant that you're trying to propagate. So if you're trying to propagate a navel orange, then you need to use some kind of a citrus rootstock. And there's lots of research done into rootstocks, which are best for different areas. But basically, you want something with a nice, strong root system that's hopefully resistant to diseases that are passed through the soil. Another word that you need to know is a scion. A scion is basically a branch or a cutting from the plant that you want to propagate. So if we're going to propagate navel oranges, it is a cutting from a navel orange plant. You have to make sure that it has buds on it, and the best grafting happens at certain times of the year when the buds are very swollen and ready to pop out or ready to grow. The bud is just the little part of the scion where the new growth occurs. You can see the picture down at the bottom. There's the desired variety, say it's a navel orange. Then you take a piece of the plant. A lot of people recommend using the part that's not brand new growth and the part that's not super hard wood yet, but the stuff in between. And you can see the buds there. They're usually right above the petiole or where the leaf comes out. On citrus, they are teeny tiny. So now that you know those three words, we can talk about grafting. Grafting is when you take your scion and you insert it into your rootstock, and then they heal and they make a single plant. So you're cloning your navel orange, your desired variety, by taking a branch of that navel orange and attaching it to your rootstock that you grew, so that when that grows, you have a navel orange plant. Budding is a specific type of grafting where you just take one tiny bud off of the scion rather than attaching the whole scion. Cambium layer is another concept that's really important in grafting. It is the layer right in between the bark and the wood. It's super thin, it's only one cell thick, so you can't really see it with the naked eye, but you can see where the bark is and where the wood is, and where those two meet, that line is your cambium layer. So if you look at this picture, you can see where it's right at the outside of the cross section, it is a little bit greener, and then it turns a little bit whiter, and then it turns brown. That brown line right there is your cambium layer. It's right in between the bark and the wood. When the cambium layer meets on your rootstock and your scion, it will heal together. So the cambium cells from one plant and the cambium cells from another plant will form a callus and create or turn that plant into, those two plants into one plant. All right, since bud grafting is the most commonly used method of grafting in nurseries for citrus, let's talk about this type of grafting first. So with any type of grafting, the first thing you need is your rootstock. I like to use Naran seeds to grow my own rootstock because I have access to it and it has worked well. Naran is a type of, it's a dwarfing rootstock, so it tends not to get too big, and it has been used in Hawaii for many years, so it's proven here. Other people like to use trifoliate rootstocks, such as C35 or Carrizo. You can see the picture here is trifoliate, has 3 leaves. But really, you just want any type of citrus that will have a nice strong root system for your plant to grow from. So once you get your rootstock, they should be at least 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch diameter. And you're going to have to go and collect your scions from whatever variety you want to propagate. So say your navel orange. You cut a single bud off of that scion. You can see in the picture below. Then on your rootstock, you're going to make a T in the bark. Some people like to use an upside down T, and peel back the bark just enough to slide your bud in there so that your cambium layers can meet. You wrap the whole thing up with wax tape to keep it from drying out and keep it from getting any fungus or anything in there. And in a couple weeks, if you're successful, when you unwrap it, you'll see that it's still green, like the picture all the way at the bottom right. You can see where the red arrows are, that the two different citrus plants have healed together and the bud is still green. So hopefully that bud will be able to grow. You need to encourage it to grow, usually, by either cutting off the top of the rootstock or cutting it in half and bending it back, because that's the only bud that's going to give you a navel orange. None of the other buds are going to be navel orange, just that one. The next type of grafting we're going to talk about is called cleft grafting. This is one of my favorite types of grafting. I use it with citrus, mango, avocado, all kinds of things. I seem to have the most success with it. It takes a little longer and is a little more work than bud grafting, but again, I have the most success with it so far. So the way that this works is similar to the bud grafting. First, you need to collect and prep your scions. In the bud grafting, I often leave a little bit of the petiole, but in cleft grafting, you want to remove the petiole as close as you can to the bud without damaging the buds. Be very careful. If you damage the buds, then the buds cannot grow, and then there's no way you can be successful. So then you take your scion that you've prepared and you cut the bottom of it into sort of an arrow. So I use my knife and I make one long, clean, flat slice on one side. Then I turn the scion over and I do another long, clean, flat slice on the other side. You want your slice to be about an inch long at least. You don't want it to be bumpy or wavy because you want it to be able to slide in there like a glove once you connect it to your rootstock. So on your rootstock, you're going to make a slit about the same length as your arrow. You just kind of make a cleft or a slit on the top of the rootstock, like you can see in the picture all the way on the right. And you're going to actually insert your wedge, your scion, into that cleft. So once you've cut your scion and you've cut the slit in your rootstock, you need to insert or slide your scion into your rootstock. And very importantly, you have to make sure you match the cambia, or the cambium layers. You can, depending on the size of your scion and the size of your rootstock, you can try to match both sides, which is ideal. That's why it's a good idea to collect scions that are the same diameter as your rootstock. But it's not always possible. So like you can see in this picture with the blue arrow, you can align just one side if you can't get both of them in there. I use this theory called the flame theory. So you can see the picture down at the bottom of the candle flame, and next to it is a picture of a cut scion. Notice that they're kind of a similar shape where it's wider at the bottom and then it comes up and it gets more narrow towards the top. So if your scion wood is just slightly bigger than your rootstock as far as the width or the diameter, and you slide it in there, then somewhere along that flame, from the bottom where it's wider to the top where it's narrower, your cambium layers are going to meet. So I like to pick rootstock that's just like maybe a half a millimeter smaller in diameter than my scion wood. Once you get it just how you want it inserted, you need to protect it. So you seal it up, you wrap it well with parafilm or grafting tape, wax tape, wrap the whole scion. And if you find that the bottom part, the actual graft needs a little bit more structure or it needs to be wrapped a little bit tighter, I often will use flagging tape instead on that, or in addition on that part. Some people use rubber bands or even string just to get it a little bit tighter. Say if your cut wasn't perfectly straight and you want to make sure that your two cambium layers are really firmly pressed against each other. Okay, so you're finished grafting. Now what do you do to take care of your plant and encourage it to grow properly? It's usually at least 2 to 4 weeks before you really see any change. But I have had citrus take over 6 months or even more before they, actually shoot out growth. They're not dead, but they just don't do anything for a while. So it's hard to say, but I would say give it a minimum of 2 to 4 weeks before you give up on it. You want to keep it somewhere in the shade, definitely not full sun. You want it to have fairly high humidity, not somewhere windy where it might get knocked off, and you don't want it to be dried out too much. But I generally don't water it for about a week, and then I'll water it, but just a little bit until I start to see it doing anything, until I see any growth starting to flush. You want to try your best to keep the wound dry, so don't overhead water it. Just water it right into the dirt part. Any suckers that come out from below your graft, you want to remove them because that is your rootstock trying to come back and take over again. You don't want to let it. If you, after 2 to 4 weeks, you notice your scion is still green, that means it's still alive, and just keep waiting. If you notice that your scion is black, then it's likely that it's dead and your graft is unsuccessful. But if it is unsuccessful, you can practice again on the same rootstock. Just cut it off, give it some time to regrow, and you can give it another shot. You have to practice a lot with grafting before you really get good at it. So don't throw out your rootstock if it's unsuccessful. So after you are successful and your scion flushes, all those buds on your scion wood start to grow, you can leave the tape on for a little while. Grafting tape, wax tape or parafilm, you can actually leave on forever because it will generally decompose on its own. If you use flagging tape or string or rubber band, those you do have to remove. I would say within a couple of months. Just be careful because it is providing support. You just don't want it to strangle your baby plant. And start pruning it early. You might want to stake it, start pruning it into a central leader, to a V, or to a Y shape. Other than grafting, rooting cuttings is a way that citrus is often propagated. Not all citrus is easy to propagate through cuttings. I have not been able to find a list of what is and what isn't, but some of the ones that I've found work pretty well are Meyer lemons, yuzu, rootstocks like Himnaran or the trifolates seem to work well. I tried with navel oranges and some other oranges and did not have any success, so it's hard to say. For rooting cuttings, you want to take either a single node cutting, which is what this picture is here. It's just kind of like a single little piece of the branch with one bud and one leaf. Or you can do a bigger piece like you would normally do with a cutting. You do want to remove most of the leaves, or at the very minimum, you want to cut off half of the leaf because the leaf is where it's going to lose its moisture, and you don't want it to lose too much moisture when you're trying to get it to create some new roots. So you prepare your cuttings, you apply rooting hormone powder, and you stick it into your media. I like to use coconut coir. You want to keep it in somewhere where it has very high humidity, so regular misting or maybe some kind of enclosed greenhouse. And you want it to have a little bit of sun, but not too much. Definitely not too hot in there. You want to keep it maybe about 80 degrees. And after a few months, if you're successful, you'll see root growth and you'll see leaves starting to flush. So let's watch a video with a little more info on rooting citrus cuttings. Air layering. Air layering is usually used for trees that are difficult to graft or root. Citrus is not difficult to graft, and citrus is not difficult to root either. So in my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to do an air layer for citrus because air layers take a long time, they're a lot of work, they require a lot of materials, and they're not always successful. So I kind of personally think that it's a waste of time with citrus. So I'm not really going to give you a lot of information about air layering because I don't really recommend it for citrus. However, I just wanted to point out that you can do it, and it will be successful very likely with most citruses. Seed propagation. Something that's interesting about citrus is that most varieties are true to seed. The reason why is because they're considered polyembryonic seeds, which means that one seed will produce multiple plants. If you've ever planted a citrus seed, you might have noticed a whole bunch of little plants coming out. Most of them are going to be clones of the mother plant. So, in other words, the exact same genetics as the mother plant, which means that it's possible for you to get the same fruit. If you plant the seed and you get a clone of the mother plant, then you should be getting the same fruit. The only reason that I don't generally recommend seed propagation for citrus is because it takes forever. If you plant a seed, you're going to wait at least 10 years to get any fruit, and you never know until you get that first fruit if it's actually going to be a clone or not. So it's kind of a waste of time. You might wait all that time to find that the fruit is not what you've been looking for, or you have to keep your tree alive for 10 years or more. When you could just graft it, and within a year even, you could be seeing flowers and fruiting. So while you can often grow citrus from seed, it's not really the best method of propagation. Okay, that's it for propagation. Now let's move into talking about fertilization of citrus. So I get asked a lot, what should I put on my citrus plant for? I want it to fruit better. What kind of fertilizer should I put on it? And it's really hard to make recommendations because everyone is in a different place and their soil's different. So I generally recommend the first step in starting to improve your fertilization is to look at your soil. Start with a soil test. For everyone in Hawaii, I recommend going to UH and doing your soil test through them. You can do it through mainland companies, but Hawaii soils are very different from most mainland soils, and Hawaii, it's calibrated for our soils. I have gotten tests from the mainland before, and they are not correct. They have a lot of errors. With the UH test, they'll give you some general recommendations, but the nice thing is you can take your results and your numbers, and you can talk to someone that works at CTAR or one of the agricultural extension agents, and they can use those numbers to give you better recommendations on specifically what you should be adding to your own personal soils for whatever crops you're growing. I recommend that you do a soil test every year. You want to look at change over time. It makes a big difference. And something to keep in mind is that there are a lot of nutrient interactions in our soils here in Hawaii. There are so many that, I personally cannot keep track of them all. So sometimes it's easier to just foliarly apply fertilizers, spray them on, rather than trying to put them in the soil. Because some nutrients that we may have too much of in the soil can bind onto nutrients that our plants need, and then our plants aren't able to take those up. So that's pretty complicated chemistry, and unless you're a soil chemist, that may be a little bit difficult to understand. It is for me, that's for sure. So I just wanted to point out that if you're not getting the results you need, foliar is not necessarily a bad way to fertilize. Okay, let's talk about some of the common and important nutrients in fertilizers for citrus. NPK, you hear that a lot when you talk about fertilizers, and that stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Very important things to know. N, nitrogen. Citrus loves nitrogen. It's, for every plant, it's probably the most important nutrient, and it is one that disappears really quickly in our soils. It gets washed out with rain, it will go out into the air, and it gets taken up and used by plants pretty quickly. So nitrogen is one that you almost always need to apply every time you put fertilizer down. It's one of those that you apply regularly. I like to do it 3 to 4 times a year. It's a good idea also to do some kind of a slow release nitrogen, because even though it's something that the plants really need and really like, it's easy to burn your plants if you apply too much of it too quickly. Phosphorus is the second most important macronutrient, and they need phosphorus for root establishment, which means that when you have a new tree, a younger tree, you definitely need phosphorus. But unlike nitrogen, phosphorus doesn't really leave the soil too quickly. So if you have been putting phosphorus down year after year after year, you probably don't need to keep putting it down. And you can actually cause problems by putting too much phosphorus down. Potassium is your K. Potassium is really important for your fruit. It's going to make sure that you have a lot of fruit, and it's going to make sure that they're sweet and juicy and delicious. I kind of look at it like a 1-to-1 ratio with nitrogen, so it's something that you do need to apply pretty regularly. Calcium is another one that citrus really needs. I like to use gypsum in my soil. Gypsum is calcium carbonate. Gypsum is beneficial because it has calcium, but it also is a soil, it improves your soil, changes your pH and so on. And you can also use calcium nitrate. I use it foliarly. Occasionally I'll use it in granular form as well. Iron is another one that citrus is really sensitive to. If your pH is more than 6.2, then you are probably going to have low iron. So that's something to be aware of. Generally, you want to look at your pH at being 5.7 to 6.2 for most fruit trees, and that's something that you'll find out when you do your soil test with UH. So once you figure out what kind of nutrients your plants need, you have to figure out how much to put on and how often to do it. I generally use a rule that's about a 1/2 pound to 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per tree per year, depending, a smaller tree would get a little less, bigger tree might get a little more. But you can use that to calculate how many pounds of your mixed fertilizer to add. Just remember, when you're adding more nitrogen, if your fertilizer has nitrogen and phosphorus, then you will be adding both of them, and you don't want to add too much phosphorus over time. Generally, it's safer to err on the side of less chemicals more often to avoid burning your trees. So do a weaker fertilization, but do it more times a year. If you're spraying stuff on, this really makes a difference. Or if you're using non-organic, chemical fertilizers, and you're using quick release stuff, be very careful putting on a lot at once. You can easily kill your trees. Organic fertilizers are a lot safer because they're lower concentration in nutrients. But because of that same reason, you need a lot more of them to get the same amount of nutrients, so it ends up being more expensive. So say you go to Home Depot and you look at their fertilizers and you see this one, this is Miracle Grow Shake and Feed for citrus, avocado, mango. And you say, oh, it says citrus, this is probably a good fertilizer. Look at the back of the container and you can see the guaranteed analysis, a little more information about what's exactly in this fertilizer. So the NPK here is 13-7-13. That means 13% nitrogen, 7% phosphorus, and 13% potassium. It is a slow release. It says continuous release, so that's a good thing. That means that it's polymer coated, so all the nitrogen doesn't just come out right away. So 13% nitrogen means that if you wanted to apply 1 pound of nitrogen to your tree annually, you would need to actually apply 7 to 8 pounds of this fertilizer over the course of the year. And it's slow release, so you could probably split it into 3 applications, maybe even 2 applications. But that's a lot of fertilizer. If you think about how big these containers are, you'd have to buy 1 of them per tree about. It shows you some other nutrients here: magnesium, sulfur, copper, manganese. We really don't need those in Hawaii in general. Of course, your soil test will tell you if you do, but most of our soils don't require those. We're already good on that stuff. We do need the iron and the zinc, which it has, but those are best applied foliarly because they have interactions with chemicals that are in the soil that might bind onto them so that the tree is not able to pick them up. So you might be putting down this fertilizer and thinking you have enough iron and zinc, but they're actually not available to your tree. So overall, me looking at this fertilizer, I'm thinking, this is okay. It would work for a while, but eventually you would want to stop putting so much phosphorus. Remember, phosphorus is important for growing roots, but once your roots are in, and you keep adding phosphorus every year, it just starts to build up and cause issues in the soil. Plus, this stuff is not cheap. There are much cheaper and better sources of the necessary nutrients that you need for your citrus trees. Let's talk about the difference between using organic or non-organic fertilizers. Some organic fertilizers are things like animal manure, chicken manure, blood and bone meal, tankage, which is also known as meat bone meal, fish emulsion. Organic is really beneficial to the soil. So you're adding a lot of organic matter to the soil. Microbes love it, so your soil is going to be a lot healthier if you're using organic fertilizers. In general, they're much slower release, so you don't have to worry as much about burning your plants. But they might not all be available for the plants to uptake really quickly, so that's a plus and a minus. Most of them they're not just one chemical. They have many different chemicals or nutrients in them. So you have all your trace elements. You don't have to worry so much about making sure you have zinc and magnesium and all these little guys, because most of them are going to be covered if you're doing good amounts of compost and tankage or bone meal. Organic is usually more expensive, partially because you need a lot more of it to meet your nitrogen requirements. The amount of nitrogen per pound in organic fertilizers is generally much lower than in non-organic fertilizers. So some non-organic fertilizers you might use for citrus are urea, which is a really good source of nitrogen. A1 is a nice source of nitrogen and potassium. Miracle Grow, like the one we looked at, that is a non-organic fertilizer. 10-20-20 or 10-20-10, 10-20 or 10-30-10, all of those types of fertilizers are chemicals. 16-16 is one people use a lot, all non-organic. They are good because they have a quick uptake. So you put it down and you're going to see growth in your trees quickly. It's easier to apply because you don't need as much of it. It's much higher concentration. So in the long run, it ends up being cheaper because you don't need as much of it. But it's easy to put too much on, and it can be really, really hard on your plants and on your soil. You can burn your plants. If you put too much and it just runs right off, that's a waste of money. Plus, your fertilizer is going into our waterways, which is terrible for the environment. Some of the nutrients can build up in our soil, which can cause so many different chemical reactions that we can't even get into it. Most of the time, when you buy a non-organic fertilizer, you know exactly what's in that fertilizer, and it's going to be just, very simple nutrients. It's not going to have any of the trace stuff that, like, for example, compost would have, which means that you have to make sure you're meeting all of your minor nutrient needs. You can't just assume it's going to be in there. And it can really hurt your soil microbiology. It doesn't add anything to the soil the way that organic fertilizers do. And it can actually take away from your soil. I've had people come up to me and tell me, oh yeah, I fertilize, I put compost down, or I have perennial peanut growing by my trees. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between fertilizer and soil amendments. Soil amendments are something that you put down that's going to change the makeup of your soil. So it might change your pH, it might add organic matter, which in turn will improve the tilth or the way your soil feels, how much nutrients the soil can hold, how much water the soil can hold. Might feed some of the microbiology in the soil. Some examples of soil amendments are gypsum, compost, mulch, such as tree trimmer mulch or any kind of biodegradable mulch, mowed green manures like perennial peanut, or if you're mowing and putting grass clippings down. Generally, soil amendments are going to have much lower NPK counts, so much lower nutrients, if they have any. Fertilizers, on the other hand, are things that you put down, nutrients that you put down for your trees to take up specifically, not for the soil necessarily, although there is definitely some overlap in these two categories. Chemical fertilizers are solidly in the fertilizer category. Manures are fertilizers that can also be soil amendments. fertilizers generally have a higher NPK count. So if you're putting down compost, it's very unlikely that you're meeting your citrus tree's nitrogen requirements because the amount of nitrogen in compost is like 1%. So if you wanted to put down if you wanted to put down 1 pound of nitrogen per tree per year, you would need to put down 100 pounds of compost per tree per year. And I seriously doubt that anyone is doing that. So I just wanted to share what my personal citrus fertilizer regimen is here at Lokoea Farms right now. So I fertilize all my trees at planting, and then I aim to fertilize 3 times a year, 3 rounds. When I plant my new trees, I usually do triple 16 or I'll do chicken manure. Both of those have a high ratio of phosphorus to provide for quick root growth, as well as a pretty balanced amount of nitrogen and all the nutrients that the baby trees need to establish themselves. Then I'll switch to a mix of a fertilizer called A1. That is, the NPK on that is 22032. So you can see that it does not add any more of the phosphorus, but it adds a fairly equal amount of nitrogen and potassium. I have a lot of phosphorus already in my soils because for years people who were working on this farm were adding things like 10-30-10, and the trees really the soil doesn't need any more phosphorus. So I do A1, and I often will add some calcium nitrate. I'll either do that foliarly or I will add to the soil. I will do urea, and I will do chicken manure. The reason I do all of these different things is because they all have something that's a little bit different. I try to get a 1-to-1 ratio of nitrogen to potassium. I try to get about a 1/2 pound to 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per tree. And urea, for example, has such a high level of nitrogen that it ends up being really cheap. So I can provide for a large amount of my nitrogen needs through the urea, but I don't want to put too much because I don't want to burn my trees. And I want to make sure that I add at least something organic to the soil. So that's why I might add some chicken manure in. Plus the chicken manure has the trace nutrients that urea doesn't have. So that's why I like to do a mixture. I generally do that 2 out of my 3 annual rounds of fertilization. And at least once a year, I try to do an all organic addition. I'll give the soil a break. I'm not going to put down any urea, no A1, and I'll use meat bone meal, which is also known as tankage. I buy that from Island Commodities in bulk. It is disgusting, but the trees really like it. The soil really likes it. And I'll lay that down, and I'll cover it with a layer of compost that I'll buy from I'm blanking on the name, the place near Waiwa that makes all the compost. And then on top of that, I'll add a layer of wood chip mulch that I get from the tree trimmers. So every year, all of my trees are getting a nice thick layer of compost and a nice thick layer of wood chip mulch, which is my organic matter that I'm adding to the soil every year. As far as micronutrients, I apply iron foliarly at least 1 time a year. Gypsum I apply 3 times with my fertilizer because calcium, I always need calcium in my soil. It helps my soil pH as well. Timing, I try to think about these things, although it's not always possible, but I try 2 months before flowering happens to increase my potassium and decrease my nitrogen. So I'll kind of do like a 1-to-2 ratio rather than a 1-to-1 ratio. And during the time where my trees are blooming, from in between then to fruit set, I try to make sure to add some kind of nitrogen or fertilizer during that time. So this is my plan. This doesn't always happen exactly as it is. Sometimes I might notice that trees need something else or have too much of something. And every year when I get my UH soil test, I kind of take that and make my new regimen for the next year. I'm also reading about fertilization and soil science all the time. It's really a complicated subject. So I just encourage you not to just pick a fertilizer and just keep doing the same thing over and over and over. Because it's not going to be the same what your trees need every time, and it's not going to be the same what your soil needs every time. So keep it open and always be trying to learn more about how to fertilize your citrus. Okay, we got through that. Thank you so much for putting up with me virtually. I hope that we can be doing this in person for our next workshop, which will be covering pests and diseases as it relates to citrus. And our last workshop, which will be covering post-harvest, quality management, and marketing challenges. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you learned something. Please feel free to email me at info@lokoeafarms.com if you have any questions, or you can comment below. Thanks again to Kahumana for organizing this workshop. Bye.